Hey, everybody. Well, I'm going to get started. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are coming in from. I'm Barb Stuckey, and I'm the Chief Innovation and Marketing Officer at Matson. And we're really excited to present some content for you today about the future of food, which we believe will be fermented. So today we'll be talking about insights into product development and consumer communication around precision fermentation. So here's how it's going to go today. I've got a couple of co-conspirators here. We have our CEO, Justin Shimek, and EVP, Katie Hagen, joining. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on who we are and what we do, in case you don't know Matson. And then I'm going to hand it over to Justin, and he's going to take us through background on product design and development. And then lastly, we'll finish up with some proprietary research results that we've got on precision fermentation that will be presented by Katie Hagen. Then we'll finish up with some questions and answers. So please feel free to send those in at any point in time, and we'll finish up there. So I'm going to start with who we are and what we do for our clients. I'm sure a lot of you know us, but we are a Silicon Valley-based food and beverage product innovation firm. And we help our clients with every phase of the journey to get new products to market. We have been in business for 45 years, and we are a 100% employee-owned firm. We have a team of multidisciplined, experienced professionals that ranges from strategists to scientists to chefs and scale-up specialists. One thing that unites us all, though, is our passion for food and beverage and making a difference in the world and our community, both locally as well as the work that we do for our clients all over the world. Our secret sauce, we like to say, to use good food pun, is that we are a holistic agency. So we are driven by strategy, and that could mean business or brand strategy, but we are also enabled by insights. We track consumer trends, food service trends. We have a very strong culinary history and team, and we do creative work to help our clients identify new compelling concepts. And what we're best known for is the technical aspects that we bring to product development in product design, formulation, and scale up and commercialization. This is the path to market for many of our projects, where we start with helping our clients identify some insight to drive the strategy, whether it's brand strategy, business strategy, or product strategy. And then along the path, we might do inspiration by heading into the field, for example, to taste products that are trending anywhere all over the country. We conduct ideations, both virtual as well as hands-on prototyping sessions. We create concepts and then move into rapid prototyping to develop the product design before we get into formal product development, where we're doing ingredient procurement for all of our clients, which is part of what today will be about. We conduct small or trial runs for our client and support the getting products to market. And if our clients need our help in identifying contract manufacturers, we do that as well. And then we will go in and lead the commercialization process. We like to say we work across 100% share of stomach. So you can see here, our clients range from the biggest of big multinational CPGs to startups that may be one or two people funding the business out of their pocket. We work across channels, from consumer packaged goods to food service to ingredients, food and beverage, and we work across temperature states as well: fresh, chilled, frozen, you name it. We work across day parts and fun and functional foods, whether you're buying foods just for the joy of eating, or you're buying highly nutritionally constrained or very nutritionally active. We also develop award-winning products for our clients. And we follow these 3 points, which we call the Matson Mantra of getting to the food fast with prolific prototyping, focusing on craveability, and building products for success so that when it's time to scale, we know that they can. We have had a role in the communication of another technology that we might refer to during this presentation, but which is not necessarily what we're here to talk about today. So the Good Food Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the research around and the product development and launching of companies into the plant-based and cultivated meat space. We were instrumental in putting together and leading a team that spent about 9 months working with GFI, as well as Upside Foods, to create a narrative around cultivated meats, which are obviously made from cells that are grown and then turned into finished products for sale, for consumption in grocery stores, as well as food service. We then came up with the nomenclature that goes along with this. So cultivated meats, which has really been adopted across this sector of the industry as the preferred term for communicating what cell cultivated meats are. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Justin, and Justin's going to take us through product design and development. Justin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Barb, and welcome everyone. I'm Justin Shimek. I am Matson's CEO and Chief Technology Officer, and for us, being based in Silicon Valley, I often clarify that's food technology. So I'm a PhD food scientist by training, also have a nutrition background. I've spent my entire career in innovation, and as you might imagine, we work in all of the spaces that Barb talked about, but increasingly, and especially over the last 10 years, we've worked a lot in the food tech space. It's been burgeoning here in the Silicon Valley, and of course in alt protein, using every type of technology, including and especially lately precision fermentation. So next slide, Barb. We'll get into that discussion and specifically make sure that we're all baselined and answer the question, what is exactly precision fermentation? So if we go to the next slide, I think it's really important to talk about precision fermentation in the context of all the types of fermentation and even some other technologies that we're talking about lately. So, we're all very familiar with the ancient processes of traditional fermentation. So the way that we make beer and wine, the way that we make delicious breads and yogurts. This is all obviously through the action of microorganisms that transform ingredients into more complex and arguably delightful products. So taking often sugars and transforming them into the acids that you might find in a yogurt, or yeast transforming sugar again into carbon dioxide to leaven bread. That's not what we're talking about here, although this is all in the realm of fermentation. Another type of technology that often is being talked about at the same time as precision fermentation, but is distinctly different, is biomass fermentation. So in biomass fermentation, that's the type of fermentation where we're actually growing the organisms themselves, often into either a protein-rich or let's say a fat-rich mode, and then further processing that biomass, the cells themselves, into food products. Lastly, and what we're going to focus most of our time on today is precision fermentation. And this is the type of technology where through specific genetic modification of organisms, we can, in a very targeted way, produce very specific ingredients. They can be proteins, they can be other types of molecules. It'll actually be a wide range that you'll see soon, but it all does start with those microorganisms that themselves feature themselves as factories. There's a couple other worthy mentions here that are not fermentation based, but often are being talked about in some of the same conversations. Barb already mentioned cell cultivation, where you take basically a biopsy of cells from an animal and grow chicken from chicken cells. That's also in this alt protein movement. And then even molecular farming, which is actually kindred to precision fermentation from the perspective of you take the genetic material, in this case, insert it in a plant and grow it. So what you'll find out is there's actually lots of different ways sometimes to get to common endpoints. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. Again, our focus is precision fermentation. As we said, it has some overlap and kindredness with biomass and traditional fermentation. What it gets into, how it's distinct and different, is that in precision fermentation, you have the ability to target very specific ingredients, ranging from things as fundamental as amino acids and vitamins, the building blocks of nutrition, to very targeted enzymes. You can create specific proteins or fats, for example, flavoring material. And the other feature often of precision fermentation is the fermentation is an upstream operation that as you go downstream and further purify the ingredients, you can turn many of these into very pure, singularly focused ingredients that can have a high degree of functionality. Whereas in biomass or traditional fermentation, again, get great products, but often not with that targeted or very precise functionality that you can get out of precision fermentation. Next slide. So, especially when we're thinking about consumers, but even all of us in the product development area, precision fermentation, while it's becoming a bigger part of the conversation, it's not necessarily new from a technology perspective. If you start to think about all of the different types of applications, there's actually hundreds of millions of people that are experiencing different types of products resulting from precision fermentation on a daily basis. So, in the non-food realm and medication, insulin as a drug is actually produced via precision fermentation, has been for many decades. Most of the vitamins that you find in supplements are proposed in this or produced in this manner. Many flavors, some colors. Most notably in the food space, the enzyme that is used to convert milk to cheese, to the cheese curds, is an enzyme called rennet. It's normally found in the stomachs of calves. However, as you might imagine, there's not enough calves in the world to support all of the cheese production that's going on. So a number of years ago, actually back in the 1990s, this became the most common method for producing this industrial enzyme that really supports the level of cheese manufacturing that we see today. So it's something that, again, it's all around us. We're experiencing it in many, many different ways. And so while it's new, it's also very common. Next slide. So at Matson, and many of you maybe in your own companies, are starting to evaluate different ingredients from fermentation for evaluation in products. This is demonstrating that there's a wide range of potential applications that have to do a lot with the ingredient specifically that's being targeted. So as I mentioned, proteins can be a product of precision fermentation. We've been hearing a lot about egg or dairy proteins that are being manufactured in this way. It's not all about protein, however. You can also have fats and oils that are produced in that way, specifically by engineering the enzymes that can create the fats and oils in these organisms. You can have very targeted and specific ingredients like collagen or caffeine metabolites, so things that are more along the lines of functional ingredients. We see sweeteners that can be sweet proteins like braisine, or precision fermentation Reb M, that is a traditional stevia fraction. And then in the biomass area, certainly, single cell fungi, it's been around for many, many years. There's lots of other single cell organisms via biomass fermentation that are coming online to create many types of protein ingredients. We've been working in this space for years, probably starting 25 years ago with corn, which QUORN, which is a filamentous fungi. So we're working very broadly across all of these different types of ingredients. Um, and we're starting to evaluate these ingredients in many, many different food systems. And from what you can see just in this slide, really the applications are pretty much endless because you have an incredible toolbox of every type of food ingredient that can really be now utilized to solve what have been really challenging food product development challenges. It's something we like to say here at Matson is that really to create the next generation of food products, you need the next generation of ingredients, and certainly precision fermentation now is enabling that in very specific ways. So these are all systems where we've done work and we're aware of work happening. But what you can see again is these ingredients will be showing up in every food product type, from food to beverage, sweet, savory, things that are highly functional in terms of sports nutrition. Also, very indulgent products as well can be enabled by ingredients from precision fermentation. Going to the next slide, this process, what this outlines is the process that the producers of these ingredients follow. So really they have their own innovation cycle that starts well upstream of what we see as professional product developers, really starting with understanding the opportunity, really from a competitive landscape perspective, what types of ingredients should be manufactured, what are the needs, what is that opportunity, what are the gaps. So the real process starts with that blank sheet of paper, understanding what's the opportunity to target, and then very specifically starting to design the molecules that are going to be those that are being produced by this technology. There's a whole range of subdisciplines here in terms of creating the strains that are actually going to be responsible for doing the fermentation. They need to be engineered. They need to have certain characteristics. So, for example, it's very, very important in these technologies to have a high production, a high titer. As you might imagine, you want your precision fermentation to be very efficient. So there's a lot of work that happens on the upstream side, engineering the strains. There's a lot of work also that goes into optimizing the feedstocks in terms of how you feed this particular process. We find that it's particularly interesting these days that there's a lot of work going on in terms of looking at agricultural waste products and byproducts and the opportunities there for utilizing them for very economical and efficient feedstocks. And then ultimately, this is a process that's going to be scaled. So all of these products are being produced in ultimately small fermenters that are going to scale to very, very large fermenters. And so there's a decent amount of effort that needs to go into scaling, very principally to make sure that the ingredients that are being created by this technology are done so in a cost-efficient model, especially if what you're targeting is a particular opportunity is something that is an ingredient that already exists, that has a cost that's already been established. Ultimately, at the very end of this process, we as product developers receive these ingredients and these materials. We have the opportunity to really figure out how to optimize their use, identify what's the killer application, figure out how we use all the other levers of really great product development to integrate them into the right product. And then what's interesting about this process and where food technologists and product developers fit in is that ultimately our experience in the product is really, really important in influencing the upstream stages. The bioprocess design stage, the scaling stage, it's really critical to have a feedback loop there, just because ultimately, as you scale a particular product and you go from, let's say, freeze drying to spray drying, you might change the product in some unexpected ways that impact its ability to fit easily into a manufacturing location. Also, our knowledge and experience in terms of solving food problems, often not having all of the ingredients that we need to solve the problems we have, can go all the way back to the beginning and influence the selection of what to target. So often we're helping our clients in this space in that way as well. But we're definitely big believers in putting it in product and understanding this in a very iterative way. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit more when my colleague Katie comes on about the consumer and talking to consumer. It is important, again, to baseline and remind ourselves that there have been a number of brands that have already launched to market. The top products on this, these were all products originally launched by Perfect Day, from ice creams to protein powders to cake mixes. Perfect Day has a whey protein from Precision Fermentation. They were also in the business initially in terms of educating consumers in this space by creating consumer products. You may have experienced some of these yourself. Down in the center, in the middle, every company is a company that's best known for precision fermentation of egg protein. They've been doing collaborations with others to launch products in different spaces. I think it's important to actually acknowledge that Impossible, while we think about that as probably one of the best plant-based brands, Impossible is actually probably one of the best known precision fermentation brands because the heme that differentiates Impossible, the iron-containing molecule, the molecule that makes the burger bleed, that came from a soy leg hemoglobin that was discovered to bring some of those meaty hedonic properties to their matrix, but ultimately was scaled separately as a process of precision fermentation and integrated into the plant-based matrix. Lastly, in the lower right-hand corner, big CPG companies have been getting into this space, innovating, creating new brands. General Mills had previously launched this brand, Bold Culture. It was discontinued earlier this year. But what you can see is that it was positioned as a lactose-free, next-gen non-animal cream cheese, really using milk proteins from precision fermentation. And so it's interesting because it's not only in the realm of startups, but also large CPGs are looking into the space. I think part of the challenge that they're going to need to crack, and Katie will talk about this more, is how do we talk about these technologies with consumers? But before we get to that, next slide. How do we go about thinking about building exciting new ingredients and new products? We work with B2B ingredient companies. We work with B2C CPG manufacturers. And so really, our approach, once we've helped crystallize the opportunity and the strategy and done some insights, and before we get to ultimately positioning and aiming and talking about these materials, is to really take a disciplined approach to understanding these ingredients, understanding them in a basic way, understanding them in a food system. We have a methodology around this that on one level is a bit like a SWOT, where we're looking at the individual strengths and also limitations of individual ingredients. But what's also really important to do that is to put it in context of what's happening in the commercial marketplace. How does it compare, any new ingredient compare to the incumbent and other ones that are coming online? Next slide. So specifically what we'll be doing is making sure that we understand as quickly as possible the characteristics, the sensory characteristics. So while many of these ingredients are being created by those that are very skilled in bioprocess and have a lot of upstream technical experience, understanding the ingredient, what it can do from a functional point of view, from a hedonic point of view, is really, really important. Putting in context, especially against animal-based competitive ingredients, is also very important, especially if that's its particular benefit, is driving something that's going to be more sustainable or free of other related animal cruelty, other types of benefits to consumers. As part of and core of our process, we get into the food fast, understand it on a very basic level in terms of what it can do, and then iterate. Ideally, always ideating around what are the highest potential product applications and providing feedback. So really, we're big believers in very early putting a new and a novel ingredient through its paces. And often this is really, really important for all of the other things that need to happen in terms of bringing these new ingredients to market, specifically generating information that's going to be important for the GRAS filings. But always keeping the consumer, their wants and needs, what it ultimately could do, how is it the hero, how can it be the killer, what is the killer application for any particular ingredient. Next slide. So I did mention GRAS really, really briefly. Many of you would be aware of that. This will be a new and novel way of creating a particular ingredient. So even if a particular protein, for example, that end protein maybe is used in the food system, maybe it comes from an animal source, being produced via this technology, producers will go through a GRAS process where they'll look for creating a dossier that looks at lots of different things related to safety, toxicology, uses. And then for us and for those that are in product development and innovation, really as a fundamental part of the GRAS process is understanding where do these ingredients work, and then also at what levels. Those are all necessary things to understand for bringing a GRAS dossier together. And so this early work is really critical in understanding not only what it can do from a business perspective, but creating this critical piece of information to be able to operate from a regulatory and safety point of view. Next slide. And last slide for me. Just a few notes in terms of working with precision fermented ingredients. Certainly these ingredients, many of them are just coming online. Many of those who are working in these spaces are working at the very small scale with very small bioreactors. So often there's limited quantities. So this requires becoming creative in terms of figuring out how to evaluate in food systems. Sometimes, we've gone to the point of creating mini burgers, mini food matrices. But again, we want to do it in a way that's representative of the ultimate food system. That's where you're going to generate the most learning. It's also really important to appreciate there's going to be a lot variability that's going to be just present in the ingredient innovation space, as well as the scaling space. When some of our clients have switched some of their downstream operations, either going from, let's say, a lab freeze dryer to a large spray dryer, or from co-man to co-man, there can be many things that might change that are seemingly innocuous, like maybe even the bulk density. A powder becomes light and fluffy where before it was dense. Those can have a lot of implications in food manufacturing. And so it's great to make sure that you understand those. And what we'll always advocate for is an iterative process. Really, to put the product into a food system, ideally get a read on it with consumers, and then learn and iterate is always the best way to help evolve these products, just because they're very, very early stage and a lot of the potential has not yet been unlocked. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Katie Hagan, and she will talk a bit about our consumer work in this space.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Hagan. I'm an executive vice president at Matson. I lead innovation engagements here and then head up our insights practice, where we create custom research for our clients of all kinds. I'm going to talk to you today about some research we conducted with some U.S. consumers this summer, specifically with regard to the nomenclature and the communication around precision fermentation. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background. Every year, Matson fields proprietary research on big issues that are affecting the food industry. And as we are seeing a growing number of our clients in the precision fermented space, we were very eager to understand better this critical issue of how do you talk about it, how do you name it, and what are the purchase drivers going to be for consumers who are interested in actually eating it. So, you've got this guy here looking a little questioning. The big question is, so what are precision fermented ingredients? Do I really want to know? And do I want them in my food? this is what we wanted to probe. There's a big question in our minds about how much information is just enough to satisfy their curiosity and their concerns, and how much is too much where it might become a turnoff. So those were our big questions. Next slide, please. So we fielded a survey online with about 450 US consumers. And we had our typical, broad demographics. So we were interested in getting a broad range of male versus female, geographic distribution, as well as generational distribution across Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and boomers, race and ethnicity as well, range of income. And one where we were actually fairly consistent was primarily speaking to those who are college educated. And what we were trying to get at is, what is consumers' understanding and acceptance of this idea of precision fermentation as an alternative to conventional animal-based and plant-based food products, and then specifically around naming and degree to which the concept is explained through science. Next slide, please. So we designed our survey with 3 ideas of positioning. A low science version of our concept of precision fermentation, a medium science, and a high science. I'm going to read you the low science version of this and then talk about how we evolve that in the medium and the high science versions of the concept. And this was a monadic test, so every consumer who participated only saw one version. And this was a made-up company. So this is not a real company Future Foods is not a real company. It's fictitious. We just wanted to frame it in the context of how we might position a food product in a project. So here's what we said in the low science version. Future Foods is a new food and beverage company that uses a revolutionary new way to make delicious versions of your favorite and most satisfying protein-rich foods from real poultry, meat, seafood, and egg and dairy. All of our food is animal-free and planet-friendly. We use significantly less water and land, producing significantly less carbon emissions. And for your health, everything is antibiotic-free, hormone-free, cholesterol, and lactose-free, and is less susceptible to the risk of foodborne illness. Sounds impossible, but it's true. And then at this point, we included a low science version of our explanation, which simply said, Future Foods is a new technology to create products with real chicken, beef, pork, dairy, and seafood proteins, but without animals. And then we went on to say it can come in these kinds of foods. It will be coming to market next year assume as a reasonable price and where you shop for groceries. So that was the low science version. We didn't explain it. We simply said it's a new technology. And let me show you on the next slide how we spoke about it in a more scientific way. So some consumers saw this, the medium science version. Everything was the same, except instead of just calling it a new technology, we said, this is a new generation of fermentation that takes proven techniques to a whole new level by using yeast to create meat, dairy, egg, and seafood proteins. So you're getting all of these meat proteins from fermentation. That was medium. And then the high science really went into the specifics of precision fermentation and exactly how that happens in at least as consumer-friendly a manner of explaining it as we could. We said, with precision fermentation, we copy the gene sequence responsible for producing protein in animals and insert it into yeast or other flora. It's then fed sustainable nutrients and nature goes to work. The science acts like an instruction guide, which tells the yeast how to produce the desired animal proteins. In stainless steel tanks, the yeast is multiplied to produce real meat, dairy, egg, and seafood proteins, identical to those that cows, chickens, and other animals provide. It's an efficient, animal-free way of creating the protein ingredients for traditional foods. So those were our 3 positioning scenarios, and now I'll share with you some of the results from the research. Next slide, please. So Let's start with the basics. What do consumers understand about fermentation and precision fermentation? So fermentation in general, the culinary process, the science process, was quite familiar. So 72% of people were familiar. On the other hand, they were not very familiar with precision fermentation. This was not surprising. And the question is, once we start introducing them to this idea, then what do they think about it? Next slide, please. So very interesting. Regardless of which scenario, low, medium, or high science, consumers saw, about 2/3 on average were very interested in trying the product. So purchase interest, top two box, which means definitely interested, probably interested, combined. We saw over 2/3 of consumers either way interested in trying a food with precision fermented ingredients. So in general, overall, we were very excited at the level of interest in precision fermentation overall. But it is interesting to see, the low science was actually the highest, and high science, I don't know that we wouldn't really consider these terribly statistically significant. And really, they're all falling in kind of a common range. In terms of how they wanted to try these new products, two things came to light here, really. One, they are interested in familiar food forms, so beef burgers or chicken. And ideally, they wanted to try it at home, which is interesting because that's polar opposite of the go-to-market strategy of the plant-based meat analogs business, where they really went after that fast food occasion to drive adoption. And what consumers are telling us here is that they would like to try those same foods, burgers, chicken, but they really want to do it at home. Next slide, please. Next, we wanted to talk to consumers about what we should name this kind of food. So foods with precision fermented ingredients, what should be this overall name for the precision fermented protein space? And here these are the 32 names that we tested in the research, but I would encourage you all to put your new and favorite names in the chat. We would love to hear from everybody. If you have other names, obviously this is a new and growing space. This is our first piece of research on precision fermented in terms of the response with consumers. And so this is just the beginning. So put your names in the chat if you have any good ideas. We'd love to hear them. And I will tell you that Barb's fave here is permaculture, and Justin loved cultivated, and I was a fan of bio-grown. So I don't know what everyone's fave is, but you're going to see on the next page what the consumers thought. So the favorite name by a long shot was cultivated, the preferred naming. Which is really interesting because the work we did with GFI a few years ago to name cell-cultivated protein was also cultivated. And this is a separate survey. These are entirely different consumers, and this is an entirely different way to produce protein. However, it is this next generation animal-free, and so what's interesting to us is that the same name popped to the top for this piece of research as well, and made us wonder if cultivated could serve as an umbrella term for the broader next generation of protein or food. Protein, I mean, it's not just protein, frankly, right? It could be fats and other ingredients. So it clearly resonates with consumers. Others that were higher on the list were bio-grown, bio-fermented, cultured, bio-crafted, but really cultivated was far and away the best one. And in terms of how this was asked, just as background, we said, with everything new in the world, what we name it and how we talk about it can make or break its success. So here are some ideas about how we might describe this proprietary process. And we'd like you to select 5 names that you think would be your favorite. So consumers gave us their top 5 names, which is the results you're seeing here. Next slide, please. Some more things to work on. I look at this slide and I see a lot of opportunity and work ahead for the people who are going to be doing the marketing and the product development of foods with and beverage with precision fermented ingredients. Because what we see here is, if you look on the left, there's a, if you can click through one more, Barb, thank you. There's some significant skepticism about precision fermentation's ability to deliver on some of these claims that consumers find very important when they think about their food and beverage. So on the left, you'll see the yellow bars are what claims consumers believe to be really important. And then the orange bars are how well they believe precision fermentation can deliver against it. So how believable is it that precision fermentation can deliver on that claim? And on the far left is taste. You can see that taste is incredibly important to the consumer, and they're very concerned about how believable it is that precision fermentation can deliver on taste. Similarly, another really important claim is safety for human health. That sounds pretty logical. And then also nutrition. So in each one of those on the far left side, those three, you can see the gap of the importance of the claim and then the believability of it for precision fermented ingredients. Versus on the right, in contrast, you can see the orange highlight of the far right, the idea that no animals will be slaughtered with precision fermented ingredients is very believable. It's not as important as taste, but the believability and the importance of it match up appropriately. And so there, it's done, right? They get it. And then there's a few others in the middle, for example, where it's not as important as taste or safety, but for example, produces less carbon emissions, uses less water and land. Those are fairly well aligned with the importance of it and the believability that precision fermentation can deliver on that. So when I look at this, it says to me, marketing has a lot of work to do to build trust and credibility, and the product development needs to deliver on the taste, the safety, and the nutrition so that we can back up those claims. Next slide. Thank you. So we asked some more questions of these consumers and found one of these to be rather interesting. We asked them, what is the most appealing attribute of the concept, that low, medium, and high science? When we asked them, this is what we're producing with precision fermentation, what is so appealing about it? And the number one answer, which you can see strongly leading the pack here, is that what we're offering is real meat, egg, dairy protein, not a plant-based substitute. And it's really the leading attribute coming, there are others, of course, that are important here, but this is really interesting and something that, out of 22 attributes, this popped to the top. So our hypothesis is this coming from a couple of things? So in COVID times, or just in general, people tried plant-based meat. They didn't think it lived up to its name. It wasn't as delicious, perhaps, as a burger. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of PR backlash in terms of plant-based meats being overly processed, and they've heard some of that. And so, coupled with premium pricing, plant-based meat is not in the greatest place at this moment. And so in response to that, we're getting an answer, which is, I just want it to be real and not a plant-based substitute. So we found this data point pretty interesting. Next slide. We did seek some consistency across the cohorts. So across low, medium, and high science scenarios, people who were placed themselves in those categories in terms of what interested them, they were really consistent, regardless of whether they had a low, medium, or high science message. The takeaway and the purchase driver for them that was important across all three of these was sustainability, animal welfare, and health and nutrition as the primary drivers in each one of these cases as the top three, which is interesting. From there on out, some of the less important drivers or less critical drivers tended to have some variability across the cohorts. But, even the low science said, hey, it sounds like a more sustainable way to get the same food I already love. I also love trying new things, and I'm curious how this would be. The medium science, animal welfare, they definitely identified that. It's great that I can have these foods that don't require killing any animals to make the food. And the high science, sustainability, it's all about sustainability for me and reducing our need for animal farming. So that was a consistency across the cohorts, regardless of where they were in terms of the level of science that they were presented with. Next slide, please. Where we did see some differences were across the amount of claimed scientific knowledge that these cohorts had. So, which is perfectly logical. In the low science group, only 7% of those people who gravitated to that low science message were familiar with precision fermentation. And whereas on the other end of the spectrum, in the high science, 18% of those people were already familiar with precision fermentation. So that makes perfect sense. As you're leaning into greater understanding of science, you're more open and interested in that information. We also saw, just as another data point here of interest, that those who were receptive to the high science message were really classic early adopter profile consumers. So you can see there in the bottom row, those who were responding to that high science positioning, they were not users of convenience foods. So that was not a driver for them in terms of how they're eating. Convenience was not primary. They are willing to spend more for sustainability than others. They don't have budgetary constraints for food, so that is not a concern for them. And then lastly, they're not concerned about the use of technology in food, not a concern for them. So that really spells out a classic, early adopter kind of profile. And then I think this is my last slide, which is another interesting, the number one driver of predictor of purchase intent was the idea, the whether they agreed or disagreed with the idea that they seek out cutting edge ingredients. They're interested in trying new trendy ingredients, and that had a 33% more likely on average to have a high purchase intent. Those people who agreed with that statement. So again, it's those early adopters, the kind of pioneers in the trial of trendy new food ingredient space. And I think that's a wrap from me on the data points. And then we just wanted to share a few top line recommendations, broadly speaking, coming out of the research. And let me just top line those. And then I think we will be opening up for questions after that. So our top line recommendations coming from this work is that we should be entering the market with familiar, broadly appealing food and drink. So along the lines of things like a burger, chicken, those kinds of products that have a foot in the familiar. Secondly, consider cultivated as a name, as an umbrella term for this next generation of food technology. It has the potential to span perhaps multiple technologies within that umbrella. We emphasize that need to emphasize that the product is real X, whatever it might be, real protein, real fat. It is not plant-based. We would want to emphasize that the product needs to be delicious, really delicious, or don't launch, really. Let's get it right. And 5, early adopters are open, have an openness to cutting edge ingredients and a strong concern for sustainability. That's who we should be finding. And then lastly, I mentioned this before, marketing needs to focus on building trust and credibility that the product can deliver on a delicious, safe, and better for you and better for the planet message. And the product design needs to back that up. That's a wrap, and we'd love to open it up to a few questions.
All right, well, thanks so much, Katie and Justin, for that information. A lot of great stuff and really interesting. I do have a couple questions that came in while you were presenting. So Katie, we'll start with you. So someone has asked, if it's possible that using the term fermentation could could dilute the meaning of that word, and would there be then perhaps consumer backlash for using precision fermentation or just simply fermentation? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think we should, I don't think precision fermentation is the language we want to move forward with. We didn't show you all of the data, but precision fermentation as a term fared very poorly in our naming test. So I think that is a bridge too far for our consumer. Even our high science consumer doesn't really want to hear about food that's precision fermented. But fermented has a lot of positive associations. It's a culinary process. It's part of how lots of our favorite foods are made, whether it's bread or beer or yogurt. And I don't think it would be, I think we need to work with that in a positive way and lean into what like fermentation as a term and as an association, as that positivity. We should lean into that. I don't know about diluting it. I think we're evolving it. We're moving it forward into the next realm of what's next for food technology and for food.
So then I just want to share a couple of names that did come in when you prompted people, Katie. So Robert Z says that I think this might be a little tongue in cheek. We should consider Petri Rancher, which is kind of interesting. Thank you, Robert, for submitting that. And then Jamie submitted climate inspired. So, focusing more on one of those benefits that we saw.
Yeah, positive and aspirational. I like it.
Definitely. And then Justin, this is a question for you from Dwayne G, who asks, what would the final beef product look like? Would it be a ground product, or could it be a whole cut of meat, like a steak? So, I think there is at least one product on the market now, and certainly I'm sure more coming, but what's your thought on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the product side of this, it could be all of the above. I think it could be an analog for any type of product that exists. I think there's actually a great opportunity for creating new to the world things that we haven't quite seen using these technologies. When it comes to precision fermentation, though, again, at its core, it's creating very specific targeted molecules. Like the example is the heme that is in Impossible Burgers. It's being manufactured as an ingredient for other places. Sometimes it can be these ingredients, to me, sometimes can be the special sauce that take good plant-based burgers to great, or good beverages to great, by adding an element of sensory or hedonic that's not present necessarily in the formulation otherwise. Same thing could be said for cultivated. I think in the early stages of cultivated cell based technologies to create these ingredients, often they're going to show up to the world first in a plant-based chassis. It's not unfathomable that you would see a product out there that would have ingredients from plant-based, precision fermentation, and cultivation all showing up in the same consumer product, because at the end of the day, they're all bringing different assets and attributes to the formulation. So again, we don't see it in a siloed way. So I think it's more of a yes and type of answer for most of these things when you get into new product innovation.
All right. So just two more questions here. And this, I don't know who to ask this of, because Justin, you mentioned genetic modification at the beginning, but Katie, I think this is more of a research question. So the question is, in the research, did we ask about genetic modification of the yeast directly? And did you allow for comments or questions from the consumers? And did anyone specifically bring up, maybe without being prompted, GMO?
I think that's a great question. We did not ask it at this early in this early survey, but it is something that is going to be grappled with, and I envision it becoming a very interesting topic in the coming year. As we know, the U.S. versus European interpretation And a lot of questions will be asked, of course. Well, you're editing genes, then therefore it's GMO, or isn't it? And so we didn't ask at this point. I don't imagine this is our last piece of research on the topic. I think that questions will only grow with that respect, in that respect. And I think it is going to be a really interesting debate going forward.
Yeah, thank you. And then the last point was, Justin, for you, what's happening with the scalability of this technology, and when do we think these ingredients are going to be available?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. I think with all new technologies, often that's the principal rubber meets the road type of question, especially when you're trying to transform a food system that's already in place, where there's a lot of incumbent ingredients and supply chains, etc. So it's evolving. I think, again, we've been focusing in this talk on precision fermentation, which, from my understanding, I'm not an expert in the basic technology, is a little more straightforward than, let's say, cell cultivation in terms of the types of vessels and tanks, but there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. So it's interesting because the question actually has multiple dimensions. There's certainly the stainless steel and needing to put in fermentation capacity. Sometimes as you get more and more advanced, you can't just take the same type of fermentation that's applied for beer and wine and simply scale it to these technologies. It's a higher grade, it's a higher level. There's obviously all the assets that go with that. The other thing too, though, that's really interesting is in some of those upstream things that we talked about in terms of the strain development and the feedstock development, because honestly, those parts of the equation in terms of how do you drive and feed the fermentation are going to be really important. And so a lot of those things in terms of the inputs, some of those costs right now are high, but there's a lot of projections in terms of how they'll get better and better over time. So again, I had, especially when it comes to precision fermentation, a technology that's been practiced, for 30 plus years. I'm bullish on that moving more quickly. I think with cultivation, which we didn't focus on today, there's a lot more that needs to get figured out.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are at the end of time here, so I just want to take a moment and I want to thank Justin and Katie. I also want to thank other team members from Matson who were involved behind the scenes, who made this webinar happen. So specifically Danica Samana, who's helped us with the back end here today, Janine Magyar and Emily Auerbach in terms of helping with the insights work, Erin McLaughlin for also sitting on the other side of what we're doing here today to make sure everything was working. So mostly we want to thank you guys for attending our webinar, and we ask that you check for an email that will contain two important things. One is a survey. We would like to know how we did, how much you learned from it, whether we should do more work in this area. And then there will be a link that you can download the PDF of what we presented here today. Also keep in mind that we are happy to present it specifically within your innovation team. If you wanted a custom presentation of it from our team, we'd be happy to do that for you. So you can reach us through contact@matsonco.com. Again, thanks everyone for today, and we will see you online, and hopefully we'll see a future of precision fermented ingredients soon. Thanks, everybody.